Good evening and welcome to tonight's Real Talk panel discussion of Till Kingdom Come as part of the Hartford Jewish Film Festival, the 25th anniversary Hartford Jewish Film Festival, and the first ever virtual Hartford Jewish Film Festival. My name is Avi Noam Pat. I'm the Doris and Simon Conover Chair of Judaic Studies at the University of Connecticut, where I also serve as director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life. And it is a great honor for us to be able to serve as co-sponsors of this year's film festival and this film in particular this evening, which we will discuss, Till Kingdom Come. In a moment, I'll have the privilege of introducing our moderator of this evening's program, Professor Jeremy Pressman. But before I do, I just want to make a couple of announcements about our format this evening. I want to welcome everyone who is joining us both through the Zoom meeting that has been organized for this program and the live stream that is taking place through the HJFF website. You will see at the bottom of your screen, we would highly encourage everyone to share questions and comments as we go through the evening, and Professor Pressman will be moderating a Q&A with our panelists. You can use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to input questions that you have as we go through our evening. And for those of you who are on the live stream, if you use the comment feature in the live stream through the hjff.org site, we will also be able to copy those questions over to for our panelists to see and respond to. One other announcement: next week we have another post-film Real Talk panel discussion. This will be a program in conjunction with the documentary film Shared Legacies on Jews and African Americans and the relationship in American history. Professor Susanna Heschel will be speaking on Blacks, Jews, and Black Jews next Thursday evening, March 18th, as part of the Hartford Jewish Film Festival and part of our Aleph Institute of Jewish Ideas year-long program on Jews, Judaism, and the pursuit of social justice. So I want to thank everyone for being here this evening and thank our panelists for joining us this evening. I'm very excited to hear what both Professor Amy Weiss and Dr. Joel Lohr have to add to our commentary about the discussion of the film. It's a great honor for me to introduce our moderator this evening, Professor Jeremy Pressman, who is Associate Professor of Political Science and Director of Middle East Studies at the University of Connecticut. He is co-director of the Crowd Counting Consortium at crowdcounting.org, and his most recent book, The Sword is Not Enough: Arabs, Israelis, and the Limits of Military Force, came out last August with Manchester University Press. So I will turn over the screen, as it were, to Professor Pressman, who will be our moderator this evening. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Pot, for inviting me to moderate tonight. And it's really my pleasure to be here for this discussion. And I think, you know, we couldn't have two better scholars to discuss Till Kingdom Come with than Dr. Weiss and Dr. Lohr. So what I'd like to do is just briefly introduce them to you, and then we'll move on to some initial reactions from them about the movie. Dr. Amy Weiss is the Maurice Greenberg Chair of Judaic Studies and Assistant Professor of Judaic Studies and History at the University of Hartford. She also directs the university's Maurice Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies and its Museum of Jewish Civilization. In the fall of 2020, she held a fellowship at the University of Pennsylvania's Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies. Her research and publications focus on the intersections of American religion, Israeli culture, and Jewish-Protestant relations. She is currently writing a book on the evolving relationships American Jews have forged with Protestants among both liberal Protestants and evangelical denominations. Dr. Weiss received her PhD from the Departments of Hebrew and Judaic Studies and History at New York University, and she'll be our first speaker tonight. Our second panelist is Dr. Joel Lohr, who is the president of Hartford Seminary, a leading interfaith graduate school located right here in Hartford, just a few miles from probably where many of us are sitting right now. He is an award-winning author, scholar of religion and passionate leader in interreligious relations and higher education. Dr. Lohr was born to Dutch immigrants in Canada and is a first-generation college graduate, earning a BA in Religious Studies at Trinity Western University in Vancouver and an MA and PhD in Religion and Theology from the University of Durham. He has held teaching appointments at Trinity Western and more recently at the University of the Pacific in Stockton, California, where he also served as Dean of Religious Life. Dr. Lohr's teaching and research has focused on the Bible, specifically on the Torah and the Pentateuch, as well as Jewish-Christian relations and dialogue, interreligious dialogue, and leadership in higher education. He has published 10 books with publishers that are both academic publishers and popular publishers as well. And his work has been noted for both its academic strength and its interfaith ingenuity. So I'm excited that we have such distinguished scholars with us. I think so appropriate for the film that we're going to be discussing tonight. And I'd like to now turn it over to Professor Weiss to get us started.
Thank you. And it's so great to be here tonight, and I thank everyone for coming. So to offer some comments about the documentary. So for those of you who have seen it, and even if some of you watching here have not seen it, I thought I would mention some of the signs that we see in this small Kentucky town and region in Appalachia, where the documentary begins. We have a sign that says the Kingdom Come Parkway on a highway, another sign, in debt, Jesus saves. And I think these two signs, among several others that we see throughout the documentary, do a really great job. And same thing with the title of the documentary, Till Kingdom Comes, of giving us information about who are the characters, so to speak, in this film. And some of the characters that I'm especially interested in, and especially the duality between, so we have, just to I want to make sure I get their names right, William Bingham III, and then his son, Boyd Bingham IV, and they're both pastors at Binghamtown Baptist Church in Kentucky, so this old coal mining region. But then we also have this duality between a father and daughter duo of Yechiel Eckstein and Yael Eckstein through the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews. So this idea of what does it mean for the next generation to carry on their father's legacy, and what is that legacy? How does that relate to questions about Jews, Judaism, Israel? And then also in the case of the Binghams, this question also, how does this legacy relate to Jews, Judaism, and Israel? But of course, they're coming from an evangelical perspective. And just to give some background, because much of the documentary also talks about the American embassy move in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And so I just wanted to give you some background on the statistics of how evangelicals versus Americans or American Jews regarded this move. So in a 2019 Pew Research Center poll, and now this is just keeping in mind, the embassy officially moved, the decision was made at the end of 2017. A ceremony marking the move occurs on May 14th, 2018. So this 2019 Pew Research Center poll is already after the move has taken place. But I think it's telling that this poll finds that almost 80% of American evangelicals held favorable opinions of Israelis, and more than 60% held favorable opinions of the Israeli government. And then looking at a 2017 University of Maryland Critical Issues poll, so this is before the official announcement, we find out that 63% of all Americans actually oppose the United States' forthcoming relocation of its embassy in Israel, but more than half of American evangelicals supported this move. So what do these statistics mean? Well, what I think they mean is that although when we talk about evangelicals, we are talking about a very broad category that within it holds a lot of variables and diversity within this group of Protestants, but yet we're talking about this overwhelming support of Israel among American evangelicals. And I think it's interesting to note that evangelical Christianity, Christian Zionism, this is not something necessarily only related to the United States. It exists throughout the world. It has become a global movement. And so in that regard, I think it's interesting how there's this focus on evangelicals in the United States and Israeli Jews. But what I find that the documentary doesn't tell us much about is, well, what about American Jews? The Jews that are perhaps living in Kentucky, who might be seeing these evangelicals at the supermarket, or maybe Jews from other places throughout the United States. How do they contend with their fellow Americans and the support for Israel? Especially if we know that more than half of Americans oppose this move. What does that mean? What does that mean for American Jews? American Jews held differing opinions as well about the Israeli embassy move. And this idea also with the duality of evangelicals and Jewish settlers in Israel, this question of that they're both working towards this idea of having some sort of control over the land of Israel, and what is the motivation behind that land and behind that desire to have that land. So those are just a few of my comments from the film. So I think I'll pause here, and then I'm interested to hear what questions there might be, and we can continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, Professor Weiss, for getting us started, and even getting us started on thinking about the family dynamics, which is a whole level to this documentary. Very important. I'd like to now turn things over to Dr. Lohr.
Good evening. Thank you so much, everyone, for the opportunity to speak with you today. Hopefully you can hear me. I don't see that I'm on the, oh, there I am. So you can hear me. I'm seeing Avipat smile, so that's good. It's good to see you all. I appreciated the film very much. In fact, I was intrigued by it, and the more I watched it, I did watch it twice just to make sure I didn't miss anything. And the more I watched this film, the more I was impressed with it. There were so many dimensions to the film that I think it drew out in ways that were sophisticated. Professor Weiss, Amy has already mentioned a couple of them, and I think I do agree with her that the juxtaposition of the two characters, the sort of, I think there's something here about legacy and parental legacy that really captured my attention in how the two children, the daughter Yael and the son of the pastor, the Kentucky pastor, how they're trying to live out the legacy of their parents, of their fathers, I guess in this case. I was intrigued by that, and I saw tension there that drew me in, and I think it's, for me, was one of the probably, I mean, as a filmmaker, I think they did a really good job of bringing that out. And just as a sort of segue into something we can talk about later, I was really taken in by some of the tensions that they're living in. I think more for Yael than for the son, although I think you could say there's tension there as well, but we can talk about some of that later. But there were some moments there, you know, as a precursor to something we might get into later. I was just taken in by how often she's in these situations where she's clearly uncomfortable with what she's doing, and yet she's doing it because she feels a higher calling or some kind of legacy call, or how important the work is. And ultimately there's sort of I think there's a whole level to this movie about trying to live out one's, you know, where does one's ethics take them, and where do they end? There's a moment there, I don't know if you saw this moment where, I mean, there's a few moments, there's so many of them, but there was a moment where she was being brought into the 700 Club in this television interview, and she's, you know, they're praying with her right before, and a very Christian prayer ends in Jesus' name. And I kind of watch for these moments. You kind of watch carefully, and you see her at this prayer, and she doesn't say amen. I mean, can she say amen to a prayer that ends in Jesus' name? She probably can't, but she's still there for this prayer because she knows it's important to be on this television show. And there's just so much interesting religious, you know, dimensions to what was going on there. But I think it was no mistake of the filmmaker that they started with a scene of the young pastor doing some target practice. I think it firmly establishes what type of Christian we are meeting. You see this throughout the film, him cleaning his gun later with a picture of Ronald Reagan on the side of the wall. This is clearly a type of Christian that they wanted to portray and wanted to capture. I think the filmmaker did a very good job of capturing that type of Christian. Just as a reminder, evangelicals, depending on how you define evangelical, which is a very difficult thing to do today, but evangelicals make up roughly 30 to 35% of the American population. And then of those evangelicals, roughly 2/3 of them would be white, and about 1/3 of them would identify as non-white. So this is not the largest group of Christians in America, but it's certainly a large, or it might be the largest group of Christians. I don't know where we are at right now with Catholic Christians, but they're an interesting group of people that I think was very firmly established that these are people who hold guns or respect carrying guns, that this is a type of Christianity that is very linked to, I think a key point we can get into later as well, is this idea that somehow Genesis 12:1-3, which I'm guessing our Jewish audience would probably know as Lech Lecha, this sort of call of Abraham, that those 3 verses, or the beginning of the call of Abraham, is really the heart of the gospel. And the good news of Christianity, and you can see this, and they really make a lot of that idea in Paul in the New Testament, in Galatians, where he talks about that all the nations of the earth will be blessed in you through Abraham, and those who bless you I will bless, and those who, the one who curses you I will curse. And there's a lot made of that in this film, and I think it's deeply important. We can talk a little bit, hopefully we'll get into the fact that not all evangelicals adhere to, there's variations in the film even, but they don't bring them out that clearly, but this idea that somehow, I don't know how theological we want to get, but within Christianity, evangelical Christianity, there's this idea of a rapture, that all Christians will be sort of lifted out before a time of tribulation. And, this is a very interesting idea, but very crazy idea. But ultimately, I think it's a very literal interpretation of some chapters in the book of Revelation. But what's fascinating for me was the tension that the filmmakers were clearly aware of, that I said this, we talked about this a little bit before we came on a few days ago. We kind of talked about some talking points. I just want to bring this one up, and we'll hopefully get into it. I don't know that there would be a person in that Kentucky church that doesn't ultimately want Jewish people to become Christian. I think that's a really fascinating point. You kind of get to it at the end of the film. Some of it comes out a little more clearly. We're going to get these filmmakers saved. I forget the exact language. You see this a few times in the film with Yael, when she says things like, well, the elephant, I think she says at one point, the elephant in the room is, once you get a few steps down, I don't even want to go there. She talks about the triggers for her of seeing Jesus being brought into the Old Testament. And I think these are really important. I think that the film tries to get at them, but you're ultimately, you're kind of doing this dance. You can see the senior pastor, the father of the young pastor, kind of doing this dance, and it kind of comes out probably because they did so much filming with this, there was so much filming that took place that they finally got to the heart of the issue about whether, ultimately, he says at one point, there's no way to the Father but through Jesus or through the Son. Ultimately, there's a moment with John Hagee we can talk about, which I thought was really important to keep in mind, that I think Christians struggle with this idea that in their Bibles it has these verses that say that at the end of time, and the film is aptly titled, it's all about the kingdom, all about the end of what will happen at the end, how will what is ultimately coming. And I'll end on this note because I know there will be good questions and we can talk more about them, but hopefully it'll get us into some good question or discussion. The Christians and evangelicals in particular, in how we define evangelicals, I think there's one study that showed over 95% of evangelicals, to be an evangelical, believes that you are trying to spread Christianity. That's a big part of what it means to be an evangelical. I can look it up. I think I have it on my screen somewhere. I can find it again. But that's directly linked to what it means to be an evangelical, that you are actively trying to convert people to Christianity. I don't know that there are many Christians that wouldn't see some type of activity around, bringing people to Jesus as important, or at least, there's some way that, there's a kingdom coming that has Jesus at its center. But there's a certain there's a skirting of issues that comes out at the end, that ultimately at the end of time, every knee, in Christian theology, that every knee will bow, every tongue will confess that Jesus is Lord. And you saw Hagee say it at this one point. I don't know if you remember the clip. They were trying to say, some of these leaders may not be as Jewish friendly as you might imagine. They have tendencies toward anti-Semitism. And they played this old clip of John Hagee talking about, what will happen in the end. And he talks about, he uses this image of a gun, that ultimately the Jews will be, Jewish people, all people will be brought to Christ, whether by their own will or will be forced to. And he has this awful analogy of the Nazis being used. I don't even want to think about that clip. It's pretty awful. Hopefully he would disavow it now. But ultimately, I think there's this idea that at the end of time, all people will come to see Jesus as Messiah. And I think this film doesn't really want to get into it, but you kind of saw it with the father at the end in that interview. Really, really interesting that they kind of captured some of that, probably because they had spent so much time in film, and he was just kind of spoke a little more freely in that moment. A lot of complex themes here we can get into. We can talk a bit about the pastor as well in the Bethlehem Church, who is an evangelical Lutheran pastor, although I think evangelical in this sense is not truly evangelical in the American sense. I think that'd be more of a historic title. But the Palestinian Christian minister. I'll stop there. There's probably more I could say, but at least you've heard some of my thoughts on the film. I think it's a powerful film. Sophisticated filmmakers done a good job.
Great. Thank you so much, Joel, for putting so much more on the table for us to discuss. I wanted to start by asking you to react a little bit more to something that Amy, you mentioned about, and then Joel, you picked up as well, about the father-child issue in this movie, that both the Pastor Binghams and the Ecksteins are both one father-son and one father-daughter relationships. And I just wonder if either of you could explore that a little bit more. There does seem to be this desire sometimes, or belief, that there's something powerful or better about the inheritance of a child of their parent, or in this case, father's responsibility. I think in my world of political science, I think of examples like certain presidents, right? The Bush family, or going way back, the Adams family. Or the Trump family more recently, talking about the possibility of a father now and a child later. And I just wonder, is there something different about when the legacy is carried on by a child? Is there something important about that? Is it meaningful to the founder that it's their child? How should we understand that it's not just anyone who's the next pastor in Binghamtown? It's at the church. It's the son.
Amy, do you want to go ahead first? Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. And well, first, Joel, I want to mention, I'm so happy you brought up the image of Boyd cleaning his guns in front of the Ronald Reagan poster. I thought that was, as soon as I saw it, this couldn't have been framed better in terms of thinking of evangelicals and who are political figures that they look up to. And, just the fact that that was the political figure that was there. But, this is a really interesting question about the role of the parent-child relationship, because, and we know that Boyd, the son of William, right? He's Boyd Bingham the fourth. So we know that he is not the second in his family to be part of this tradition, that there were others before him. So in some ways, it's this question of, is there another option? How much of his life has been that he is going to inherit his father's post? The idea that his father seems to be the senior pastor. Boyd is the younger one. And then there was a clip towards the end of the documentary where we see a younger William, who I believe he's in Israel, and he is, having this experience about, his faith, and we see him as a younger version. And right, and as I was watching, I'm thinking, oh, okay, so we're seeing him sort of in the position that his son is currently in. So I think there's a question of agency, how much of, and I don't have the answer to this, but is this something that Boyd, and same thing with Yael, have they been groomed for this? And I don't mean that in a pejorative way, but I mean, how much are they continuing on? And I think there is something about a family legacy where who else knows the ropes better than someone part of the family. It's the family business. You work on it during the day, and at night you go home and you talk about it over the dinner table, for instance. So it's this idea of who else would know. And then we sadly see Yael's father pass away during the filming of the documentary. And this idea of, it's hard to tell in terms of timing when Yael is getting on planes to continue on with her work. But the way it's cut, it seems that she is speaking at her father's funeral, and then she's on a plane continuing the work. And in some ways, it really gives us a sense that she is by continuing the work, she is continuing the connection with her father, the legacy that he built, and it's through her that is going to continue. So I'd be interested to know if we had Boyd and Yael here, what they would tell us about this idea of, is this what they always wanted to do? How much choice do they have? Is this something that they, because she even says, I'll end on this, that she says, when it was, take your parents to school day or whatever, or you had to talk about what your parents did, she always said, well, can we just skip over me this idea of saying, oh, well, my father directs the International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, right? It's not perhaps the typical response. So even that is this question of how do you explain this to others? And now she is continuing in this legacy, and how might her children explain what she does?
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, I would also say that I think there's just, the film taps into a natural human, I don't want to claim everyone has this, but I think a good deal of us do. If I know my friends and know my family and know myself, we want to please our parents for the most part. We want to be blessed by them, accepted by them. And I think you see something of that in this film where both children are trying to live out the legacy. The film kind of captures some of that. I remember this film where the scene in the film where father and son are sitting on the couch. I'll just be completely transparent here. Parts of this film just kind of repulse me. Like I'm not really excited about some of the things I see in some of the church settings, but there's also some tenderness between father and son sitting on this couch. And, when I was in Israel and we're going on this trip together, and there's this sort of familial tenderness there about them going together, and they kind of play on this, like living out the legacy of the father that was in Israel. They played the old video, which I found so funny, it's on this boat, and then this very emotional moment, which is not uncommon in some of the televangelist sort of ways of preaching, and he breaks into tears, and then there's a man on the boat trying to get everyone to stand up and sing, and no one will stand up. But I don't know, I find these things kind of weird or funny, but then he has his moment where other people are crying when they're at the, I think they're at the tomb, or I can't remember where they were in Israel, but where the son is now preaching in Israel, and sort of like this, like father, like son, and you have this a bit with the Yael and her father, Rabbi, and that kind of handing over moment almost felt kind of like I don't know if it was a biblical moment, but you can kind of imagine these moments where there's sort of like the child takes over for the father, and now I'm going to go on and do other fun things, but now my daughter is going to live out this, as the new president, and she gets to announce the $5 million gift. And I think the film, for me, it has so many dimensions, but that was one dimension that I thought the filmmaker did quite well, and it kind of pulled me in. And I'm sure there are people in the audience who have similar feelings about wanting to ultimately make your parents proud. One of the hardest things about coming to Hartford Seminary is I don't know if my family is very proud of me, or my parents are that proud of me. They were proud of me for a long time, but I now do work that's interfaith that don't know that they fully understand or want to understand. Or, I work with Muslims, I work with Jews. I have this sort of, I know that feeling of wanting to be blessed or wanting to feel accepted by your parents or loved by your parents for what you do. So anyway, I found that a really fascinating part of the film. For me, it was a really touching part of the film, even while parts of it were kind of icky, if I can use that. I mean, there was just parts that just were really discomforting for me. I just did not like scenes of how money was being raised, how, the prosperity gospel, if you're familiar with that kind of language, like just if we're going to be blessed because we're giving to Israel, or if you give this gift, or, we're going to buy this, you saw that scene where they bought the land, which they saw as a direct correlation because of the money we gave you, this kind of way of looking at it's, for me, it's really uncomfortable. But.
Before I turn to the next question, Amy, can I just ask you on that last point, were there any parts of the movie that you found either uncomfortable, or maybe, to use the new scientific word, icky, or
right, the new academic
concerning
term,
in any way? Or?
Well, I think I would have to echo what Joel said about this question of money, because when Yael comes to Kentucky, she's getting, they're driving around, she's getting the lay of the land, and they're passing homes that are boarded up. And Yael says, oh, or maybe I think Boyd says, oh, people live there. And she says, people live there? That looks like an abandoned home. The idea that there are no doors, the doors, it's just plywood over windows and where the doors would be. So then it's this question of, so this community is living in poverty, or many of the people in the community are living in poverty, but yet they are giving money to support the International Fellowship for Christians and Jews, this idea that this organization then is giving money. We see Yael giving food to elderly Jews, that they are doing work in Israel. So it's this question of, well, okay, who's taking care of them? Where is that money going to? And this idea, right, you see during one of the church services, the collection plate is going around and people are giving money. And so it's just a question of who in the community is looking out for them. And that's not an indictment of the community by any means, but I think it's just a question of, we also see this relationship between Israel and the United States, between, at the time, Donald Trump, Benjamin Netanyahu, and it's this question of, this focus is on everything's going to Israel, right? That's where the second kingdom is. But for the meantime, and I think this is one of the reasons why, even though Yael might be uncomfortable with some of the work that she does, why she continues it, because as it stands, the second kingdom hasn't happened. So it's a question of, well, is it going to, is it not? But at the same time, if it hasn't happened yet, what do we do with this community that is giving money to Israel, but maybe not giving money to reinvest in its own community?
Yeah, thank you. And I think that also nicely ties together the prosperity point, Joel, that you were making, in the sense that I wonder if that then becomes a justification, right? We can give this money away because at the end it's going to create more money, right? If as Pastor Boyd says, what is it? We expect God to bless our church because we help the nation of Israel. So you can kind of use that language maybe to respond to what you're saying. I wanted to jump to a scene that has been mentioned, but I want to hear, maybe we'll start with you, Joel, on this, and if both of you want to react to this, is the scene when on Pastor Boyd Bingham IV's trip to Israel-Palestine, he is sitting with Reverend Dr. Munther Isaac, who is the evangelical Lutheran that you referenced earlier in Bethlehem, who is a Palestinian Christian. And just to remind people, Reverend Isaac is giving Pastor Boyd Bingham a hard time, right? He's saying many Palestinian Christians are leaving Bethlehem. They're leaving because of the Israeli occupation, he tells him. And he basically, I think he, as I recall, explicitly comes out and says, the contribution that you American evangelicals are making to Israel is having a negative effect on Palestinian Christian life here. And Pastor Bingham, in response, immediately in the conversation, falls back on, I guess I'd quickly summarize as God's covenantal promises in the Torah or the Old Testament, like to Abraham and to Moses, that this land is for the Jews, and that's how he conceptualizes it. And I think he later tells us after the meeting, but to the camera, that he doesn't believe that there are such things as Palestinians. So just with that sort of brief reprise of the conversation, how important did you think that conversation was? You know, what did you make of it? Is there a movie to be made, a documentary about the American Christian relationship with Palestinian society? What was your reaction to that segment of the movie?
Yeah, I was, I'm really interested in interfaith dialogue, but I'm also quite taken in by intra-faith dialogue. And I think there's actually some going on the Jewish front in the movie as well. And I'll just say this about that. I thought it was interesting that at one point in the film, someone said, well, we realize that our American Jews, most of our American Jews don't agree with, or, we weren't getting the full support we thought we would get from progressive American Jews on settlement. So we had to go to evangelical Christians. It was something about like that kind of way it approached this, which I thought was really interesting. There was kind of an intra-Jewish discussion going on there as well in the film. But the discussion between the evangelical, or I'll just say the Palestinian pastor in the church in Bethlehem and the evangelical pastor Bingham, it just was a reminder of how far apart, even within the same religious tradition, people can be, and how often we don't want to listen or talk to each other. I really don't think there was much of a discussion going on. It felt like monologues on both sides. Polite listening, maybe because we're on camera, maybe because it's like, what can we really get into in an hour conversation or 2-hour conversation? I don't know. I think with, a lot of these issues, evangelicals and mainline, if you want to use mainline Christians as another, or Catholic Christians, there's not a lot of agreement on how to look at these larger questions of what it means for kingdom to come. Is it an action on our, sort of social gospel by bringing in changes in our society that help each other, this sort of like larger mission. And then there are those who have a very strong view on Israel, like we saw in this film, which is a pretty small segment of, well, a small segment, but it's a large part of evangelical Christianity. But I grew up in a church that was Reformed Christian, which I think would be considered broadly evangelical, but we really didn't believe in this idea of premillennial theology, or this idea that a rapture would come and then some, Christians would be taken out of the picture, and then there'd be this time of tribulation, and the Jewish people would ultimately kind of go through this tribulation and become part of the kingdom somehow at the end. Like, that was not something I grew up being taught. There was definitely no graphs about, the rapture taking place and Christians getting whisked away. And yet we were evangelicals. But we also agree. I mean, it's a very different time now. I don't think this is true as much anymore, at least. But we also didn't really, but I think this might be true of this Kentucky church. I don't know what they would think of mainline Christians or progressive Christians. I don't know if they would think they're real Christians. I kind of grew up in an environment that kind of looked down on Baptists because they mowed their grass on Sunday, and we were kind of Sabbatarians. We didn't do any work on Sundays. For Jewish people, it sounds so strange that there's the idea of a Sunday being a Sabbath, but anyway, it's a whole nother conversation. But, so there's a whole, range within Christianity here. I felt like it was a monologue between two people who ultimately didn't want to listen to each other. I don't think it was a very fruitful conversation. It's unfortunate. I think they were polite to each other, but I don't think that the Kentucky pastor Boyd really wanted to hear that, that your theology ultimately has a pretty destructive element to it, that there's a lot of, all of this is building up to an Armageddon. Like that's kind of what all this theology is heading towards. And I don't think he really wanted to think about what that means. I don't know if it's because, well, I'm going to be out of here, I'm in a rapture. I don't think he would say that out loud, but I think there's an element of that. So,
Amy, did you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, in answer to your question, there's definitely a movie to be made here about how the diversity within evangelicalism and how evangelicals understand Israel, understand Palestinians, this idea. And I think it was really telling that, right, we got the sense that Boyd, right, there was this level of politeness, but I was even a little uncomfortable with the tone of the conversation. But we really, it seems that we really see his true colors when he leaves, and he's seeing this idea that he's saying that, right, I'm even discounting who I was talking to, that his entire identity, he suggests, doesn't actually exist. And so here I see it as a missed opportunity to hear about, well, wait a second, you are actually living in this land, as opposed to Boyd and his community is living in Kentucky. So this idea of what are you experiencing, right? We are experiencing it in some ways secondhand because we are not there. We come occasionally, we send money, so we do have that connection. But what is an everyday average life like for you? And how do you understand, right? We share the same religion, but I think just like Joel said, this question of, would they agree that they share the same religion? That they seem to have very different viewpoints.
So let's open it up a bit now to some of the questions that are coming in from the audience. The first question I want to share with you from Suzanne, I think brings us back to this question of that scene. I think, Amy, you mentioned that seeing Yael seeing the dilapidated house in Kentucky and kind of wondering about money going abroad when there might be needs at home. Suzanne says, I wondered while watching this, what happens when or if the Christians realize they've been had in a way. They are poor, yet still giving so much money to Israel, and the Israelis seem to be taking advantage of the Christians' beliefs. In the end, does this risk engendering more anti-Semitism?
Yeah, I don't know what to say to that. It's such a good question. It's such an important part of the film. I felt like there was just I'm sure, I don't know, I'm guessing most people in the audience tonight felt uncomfortable with what was going on there. There was a moment, I think it was when they were sharing, when he meets back up with Yael in Israel, Palestine, they kind of have this conversation about the buying this chunk of land, and here, they show a picture of the bulldozer, we're breaking ground. And it's almost like she had this defense mechanism. I don't know what was going on. I can't judge. I don't want to make assumptions about what she was thinking, but she kind of immediately said, well, there's a study out there that shows that people who give to Israel, their churches, they do well, financially or something. And it's almost as if she didn't know what to say. Like, I don't know. I don't want to judge what she was actually thinking in that moment, but it was an uncomfortable moment, I thought, in the film. I just don't know.
I mean, Joel, just to interrupt for a second. It's a very useful line for her, right? I mean, there's an element of her job that is sales or marketing, development.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, she looks like I don't know. Again, I can't predict these things, but you kind of wonder what she'll be thinking 10, 15 years down the road, and how she's going to look back on those moments, or how, the moments on the 700 Club where she was interviewed and the things she said there. And I guess you can kind of, I don't know, it just feels like when to that point when they were traveling around in the car, and the poor homes, and, some of our Sunday school children come from here, and they're putting their pennies into this fund. And there's something about it that just strikes me as kind of the televangelist movements. And, I've seen these where, people come forward to get healed and, give money. And I don't know, it just feels both sides, it just feels deceptive to me. And it feels like it's preying upon people's weaknesses. And I don't know if it's not just going to contribute to anti-Semitism. It's going to contribute to, the way religion in general is poorly portrayed, and how religious people, although I think there's a danger of anti-Semitism that could grow out of it, especially if some of those stereotypes around money are, alive in people's minds. They might watch that and further those, but I think it doesn't look good on either side, and hopefully, I think it's bad for religious communities in general to see those sorts of activities about preying upon those who are vulnerable.
Amy?
And I mean, I think this question really gets at one of the core tensions between Jews and evangelicals, especially when it comes to questions about the land of Israel. The idea that, well, why, right? Are evangelicals partnering with Jews because they're ultimately hoping for this end time scenario where Jews will convert, the Messiah will return, and for Jews, this question of, well, right, and again, this idea that for the Jews that we saw, and specifically the Israeli Jews that we saw in the film, well, if the second coming hasn't happened, well, we don't have to worry about these theological and ideological questions, right? We can, and Yael even says that, it's hard for me to think 5 steps ahead because then that's where I really have to question what I'm doing. So in some cases, right, it's easy to just think about what you're doing right now. And so I would say that, I think that these individuals that we're seeing, I don't think that they would see it as either one is being had, that they both see this as a mutual beneficial relationship, that it's working right now. And it's a question of, will it work in the future? Right? I don't know. They may not know, but it's a question of, well, if it's working right now, don't fix what's not broken. But I think this idea here that we're seeing is really important about this relationship. And Joel mentioned this relationship among Jews and relationship among Christians. And where is it that Jews and evangelicals have more in common? And where is it that Jews and evangelicals have more in common? And I think that's a really fascinating point about Israel, how in some cases more ideological, political, right-leaning Jews might actually have more in common when it comes to Israel with evangelicals than they do with more liberal Jews. And so, that's a question that isn't so much explored here, but that's the other side of the coin.
Thank you. And I really, before we turn to the next question, I want to say I really appreciate that both of you have been raising both the intra and inter questions, right? Both what's happening between Christians and Jews, but also what's happening within the Jewish community and within the Christian community. I think you're right, Amy, that all those relationships really deserve further scrutiny. We've been throwing around this term evangelical tonight, and obviously it's a central term in the movie. And David asks, I think, a foundational question. Can you explain the variety of evangelicals? And to what extent does this movie tells us about a certain group of evangelicals? What else should we know about the larger evangelical community and maybe some of the variation inside that community?
It's not something I study, actually. It's just something I know a few things about, but it's something Amy studies, so you can take a first stab. I can share something.
Well, I was going to say, how much time do we have? Because I mean, this is a great question, but it's also, this idea of the diversity that exists with evangelicalism is so vast. So I think it's important to start with, well, what does that mean? This idea of, and this is echoing what Joel had already said, this idea of this focus on evangelism, of spreading the gospel, spreading the good news, of trying to get others to practice this religion. It's also looking at the Bible and seeing the Bible as the word of God. And another big component that overall an umbrella of this term evangelical would fall into is this idea of a born again experience. The idea that you have committed yourself to Christ, and it's an experience that you can look at anyone and say, right, you've had that experience. And I saw somewhere, I forget where I saw this, that a historian had previously said that, well, how do you define the term evangelical? And it used to be do you like Billy Graham or not? If you like Billy Graham, you're an evangelical. If you don't like him, then you're probably not an evangelical. And I think that, whether that is actually a true statement or not, I think is very telling of how evangelicalism has changed, right? We can look back and question, well, where does Billy Graham in the history of evangelicalism fit in? And I think many would say that he probably falls more on the moderate side than on the more conservative aspect of evangelicalism. So, and I think in the comments, it was a question related to this about that not all evangelicals do support this idea of the second coming, of that Jews are needed for this rapture. That's true, that there's this big diversity in terms of what's expected. Are you going to play an active role in this? Are you going to step back and see what happens in terms of letting history unfold and whatever that means? For instance, during World War II and the Holocaust, there have been a lot of studies done on American evangelicals. How do they understand what's going on in terms of, and they're actively, just like many other religious communities, are listening to the radio or reading the newspapers about what's going on, and how do they see this relating to the history and the future of Jews? And there's a big diversity in terms of, are they participating in rescue efforts? Are they, this is what's happening, so maybe this is God's will, or a variety, right? And I'm just giving two examples. I don't want to suggest those are the only two, but there's this variety of how they respond, I would say, respond to history. Not that that's necessarily an indictment of their, of what they think, but that's their response to how they understand the world and how the world is playing out.
Great, Joel.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on this because I think, there's a lot of diversity within evangelical Christianity, but the thing that really, it's already been touched upon, but I think it really needs to be underscored. There are two things that seem to be, Amy talked about being born again. I think you can also lump this in with somehow, following, and the Pew data shows this too. I just looked it up again. I have it on my screen here. It says, what does it take, or what does it mean to be a good evangelical? And the number one thing is that you follow the teachings of Jesus in a personal way in your life, in your family life, like that. So that's like the number one. The number two, which I think is really important for this film, because it comes out, but kind of in subtle ways, and it's the issue that's the elephant in the room, or at least, well, there's two elephants. One is about what happens at the end, but the other is this other thing, and it's this, and it's the number two thing. 94% of evangelicals agree that this is what it means to be a good evangelical, that you're working to lead others to Christ. You are evangelizing. You are, that's what it means. And they kind of flip this in this Pew survey later, and they say what's incompatible with evangelicalism, and this other, they say 95% of evangelicals say it's incompatible to believe there is another way to salvation. So only 5% of evangelicals think that you can be saved, or that you have a relationship with God that's legitimate, or something outside of Jesus. Like that's kind of like, it's incompatible to think there's another way to salvation. I mean, salvation is very evangelical Christian language. I don't even know that I use it as much anymore because I don't find it that helpful. It's like, well, I'm saved, the old, joke about Jesus saves, Moses invests, or something. But, I don't know, this, like, the word saved and salvation is very important within evangelical Christianity. And there's an urgency about bringing people to Christ and helping them convert to Christianity. And so when you think of evangelicals, there's a lot of diversity in whether they believe there's going to be a rapture, whether there's 3.5 period, part of the tribulation will happen and then you're raptured, or there's no rapture, or we're not even in a millennium, or the millennium is already here. They kind of have this variation within evangelicalism, although I think the majority of evangelicals hold to a kind of rapture idea that you're reading about in these kind of weird stories and movies. And what we saw in this movie, I think a good number of them would. But I think there is a defining feature of evangelicalism, and that is that they want to convert people. That bringing people to Christ is a hugely important part of what it means to be an evangelical. Or you wouldn't call yourself an evangelical because it's tied into this idea of evangelism. And so, I can just say that about the film, that's kind of an interesting point that they're not talking about a lot, but it's certainly in the background. this idea of, do you want to convert me?
Yeah. Let's turn to a different question from the audience now that asks you to look at the film from a different perspective, to put yourself in the director's chair for a moment. Maya Zinstein. And for those who are interested and maybe didn't see it, she recently did an interview in the New York Times that people may find of interest. It was in late February, where she answered a number of questions about why she made the film, etc. But what do you think her goal was in making this film? Question from Merle. I know you don't know her inner motivations, but I mean, if you had to read the film, where do you think it's directing the viewer?
Well, she provides, all I can say is that on the website associated with this film, she provides her own take on the film. And it's definitely coming from an Israeli Jewish perspective of, let's look at this phenomenon of American evangelicals and their support for Israel, especially in conjunction with the Jewish settlement movement. I think there is this, right, those are the two American evangelicals, Jewish settlers. Those are the two major groups that are portrayed. And we don't necessarily, and it's very interesting, I think, that we only see Maya at the end, that she really stays out of this, but then it's a choice at the end that we're seeing her in conversation with the senior pastor. So, I think it's this look at, because on the one hand, right, we're hearing from Joel of how big this American evangelical population is. But then on the other hand, it's also a question, despite how big they are, I don't know if everyone in the United States or abroad actually necessarily understands this connection between evangelicals and Israel, and evangelicals and Jews for that matter. So I think in some ways, this is a really, really specific look at this one segment of a population and trying to get a handle on what's going on here. Do other people know about this? Just as right? I mean, this is a fascinating look at this community. It's right. It's almost this anthropological study of a community that, right, does everyone know about? And I think so. In that sense, of course, I'm so happy this film was made, because it's capturing. So, this is what's going on. So I think it's important to be told.
I'll just say very quickly, I agree. I think there's an element too where, if you just look at the film and how it's made and the multiple layers to it, I think she set out to make a film that was balanced, and tried to. Some might argue with it, but I think she was trying to show what's going on in evangelical Christianity, what their beliefs are, at least at some level. How does it figure in political America? What's going on with, settlements, and why are Christians supporting some Christians supporting settlements, evangelical Christians? I think she wants to expose things that might not. It was educational for me as well, and I feel like I know a few things about these matters, but I haven't been updated in a while. I used to follow John Hagee and some of this Christian stuff a long time ago, and haven't really been part of it. But this was a good update for me. It was an educational film to see where things are at. I hadn't fully comprehended, or maybe I'd forgotten about how, there's this idea within Christianity of like God's timetable, that these things have to happen, and that I didn't really put two and two together just how much certain evangelicals like John Hagee and others see that the moving of the embassy to Jerusalem, that is part of God's timetable, and the next, or at least this is one step closer. Like when Pat Robertson says, we've been waiting for that for years. Finally we got a president that's going to, move these things along in God's timetable, and the stages that are coming are, the building of the temple in Israel. That's what has to happen. And there's an urgency to that within certain segments of Christianity. The temple has to be rebuilt. And moving the embassy, I didn't realize that evangelicals in that segment were really seeing that as part of, like, I can read about this in my Bible. Probably because I've just been out of that world for so long. But it was eye-opening. It was I think it's an educational film with a yeah, I don't know if with a twist, but it's certainly an educational film. I think there are a lot of people who I came away from it learning some things, and I feel like I know a few things about this stuff. So
I want to, in the interest of time, I want to group together a couple of questions that have come in, and I think what they share is that they're asking the two of you to think a little bit about something that, as you've said, the movie does raise this question of, how should Jews feel about this love they're getting and financial support they're getting from Christians, but really to think about the Jewish community that isn't as much the focus, I think, in this movie. So Avi asks, what might be the implications of this evangelical and right-wing Israeli relationship for the future of progressive Zionism in the diaspora? Is this a cause or a symptom of the seeming growing distance between parts of the American Jewish community and right-wing governments in Israel? So that's one sort of kinds of questions about it. And then Jacqueline asks, how does an Israeli Jew, or an American Jew for that matter, reconcile the fact that evangelicals' support for Israel is predicated on a conversion of Jews in the end?
So, I mean,
I've put so many questions, I've stunned you into silence.
I know. Well, I will say, I mean, great questions, right? I think Avi's really highlighting this question that in real time, people are trying to figure out when it comes to the various American Jewish communities. And when we were, Avi, I'm happy you mentioned this when we were talking last week about the Israeli decision to look at for Jews converted, for individuals who convert to Judaism within more liberal strands of Judaism within Israel, they are now recognized as Jews. So this question of even who is a Jew has been contested among American Jews and Israeli Jews. And the idea that previously, it's interesting, previously individuals who had converted to liberal strands of Judaism outside of Israel were considered to be accepted. But then it's just this question of, but in Israel, right, then it somehow is more stringent. And so, yeah, I think this is the question of what's going to happen next, especially because you have a large segment of American Jews who don't support issues relating to the expansion of Israeli settlements. So this idea, in some cases, the segment has perhaps more of a connection with liberal Protestants who might support the BDS movement, for instance. So it's a question of what happens there when you have these connections across the religious divide, and maybe that divide isn't as big as people thought. So that's one aspect. And then Jacqueline's asking a really great question. How do Jews reconcile this fact? And I don't think there's one way to go about it. I don't necessarily know if some people can reconcile that. I think Yael makes this point of she just doesn't think about it. She doesn't think those steps through, because when you do, you have to wrestle with something. And what if you don't like the answer, right? This is what she has dedicated her life to doing. This is what her father dedicated his life towards doing. And not to say that, right, it's International Fellowship of Christians and Jews, but where are they getting a lot of their funding from? It's coming from evangelicals. And right, not all of the money is going towards, right, it's going to help people in need, right, to feed people, right? So maybe there it's a question of, in that case, doesn't matter where the money is coming from. And I understand some people will definitely say, of course it matters, it always matters. And others might say, maybe the end goal is what matters. And if it's going to help people, then that's what matters. But, Jacqueline, I hear you. I think this is a question that is still being debated about evangelicals from 30, 40 years ago and evangelicals today about this question of those that support Israel. What is their ultimate motivation? And do we even know that ultimate motivation? Right? Is it something, if you say it publicly, does that mean that you believe the same thing privately? So again, really great questions.
Joel, did you want to?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a lot to add other than I think Amy mentioned this as well, but I do think the film brings out some interesting tensions for the intra, and we talked about this earlier, but just again, how do if you look at that, I think her name was Sandra, I'm going to call her the Christian settler lady, the kind of the character in the film who was kind of like, we need to be doing this work. I'm guessing that there are certain, segments of Jewish population that can identify with that position, and there are certain segments that find it very of Jewish population that find settlements very difficult in the same way. So there's like connections between more, certain Christians and certain Jews that that they may have about the state of Israel and politics. I'm guessing there's wide variety of political positions within American Judaism on Israeli politics, and that's going to be true within Christianity as well. And so I'm guessing there are certain evangelicals and certain Jewish people that have a shared view on embassy, shared view on politics in Israel, and you're going to find certain Jewish populations that are going to have more in common with other types of Christians who have a different view on settlements. So, this is maybe a totally different point, but I remember we did a thing at Hartford Seminary once where it was called Black Church, Black Mosque, and Black American Christians and Black Muslims came together to talk about what it was like being religiously Christian in America as Black African Americans, and what it was like to be religiously Muslim as Black and African Americans. And there were moments where they talked about their shared experiences as Black Americans. They had more in common. I remember this Christian pastor saying, I feel like I had more in common with you as Muslims who are Black than I do with white Christians. And I think that you can have these moments across religious boundaries where you share more in common because of some of your views on social issues or political issues. So, I mean, the way that politics are tearing apart families and Christianity is really quite startling. And I'm guessing that's true within Judaism as well.
Great. I just wanted to maybe finish with one more question about alliances. And we've been talking in a very specific way about the evangelical Jewish or right-wing Jewish alliance. But I mean, should people walk away from this movie thinking there's something unusual here? Or is this just, this is how politics works. You find people who share a particular goal that you're pursuing, and you work with them. And there may be other goals where you look at things very differently, but on this issue, you look at it the same way. Or do you think that there's were there things in the film that struck you as, no, there's certain things that are, I don't know if they're unique, but at least they're unusual or exceptional about this particular relationship?
Well, I think I'm happy you mentioned this point about, is this how politics work? Because the one thing that I was I was struck by several things, but one of them was one of the Israeli Jewish settlers is the political access that he seemed to have in the United States to put forth his seemingly his own agenda. So I don't really know the backstory there, but it really seemed in some cases that you have this contingent of Israeli Jews who have found individuals in the United States, and many of them politicians, who are evangelicals or share their political goals. So they've aligned with them. And in some cases, I would say that is how politics work. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but just this idea of how do you get your agenda across? You find people that you can work with and you make it happen. That doesn't mean that those are going to be your allies for eternity. Those might be your allies. Well, it's possible, but those might be your allies for one specific project. And then you move on and you find someone else to work with to accomplish those goals. So I think, when we talk about American evangelicals, that's one of the really fascinating things, is to see in some ways how this group became from in some ways a subculture into the mainstream, and how their politics have really been infused in American society. So that itself is fascinating just to see, especially from the end of World War II into the present, how evangelicals have used the political system to try to make sure that the United States is reflecting their own values. And I think that a variety of groups do that, right? You want the political system to better mimic what you believe and what you want society to look like. Of course, right, when a variety of individuals think society should look different, then we have a problem. Well, how do we marry those ideas together? But I'm not going to answer that.
Yeah, Joel, before you jump in, I just wanted to interject. We haven't talked much about Lara Friedman, who's plays a small role as a talking head in this movie, the president of the Foundation for Middle East Peace. But I think she would share some of the viewpoint that you just expressed. And she, for instance, in the movie mentions that you have settlers directly coming to Capitol Hill and lobbying and finding that reservoir of sympathy that you described there. Joel?
Yeah, I don't want this to, I know this is Christian language, turn into a confessional booth, but there's an element of confession here. Just, watching the film raised a lot of sort of skeletons maybe in the closet for me to, realize that I'm connected to a faith that makes me, I'm not sure I want to be connected. Like, I grew up not having a terrible view of evangelical Christianity because we belonged to it in some way, but we were never kind of part of the mainstream evangelical movement with guns, American, because the Canadians are kind of different anyway. We just we don't get guns. We don't understand the whole American obsession with that sort of stuff, or military might or nukes and all that stuff. That probably sounds strange to just kind of blurt out, but so there's always this kind of weird relationship with evangelical Christianity. Even though we had this growing up, we did have that shared sense of Christianity being really important, and a relationship with Jesus being important, and bringing people to Christ was important, all that stuff. But this film just makes me realize that I have a lot of, I don't know how to relate to my own family. And maybe it's sort of like we have this in our own family lives, where our siblings or our cousins or the uncle makes you uncomfortable. And it's like, yeah, I guess that's my uncle, but I don't like this is my family. And I feel that way about, what happened in Nazi Germany. I can't say that what happened in Nazi Germany is not connected to me as a Christian. It is. And I'm ashamed of it, and I'm embarrassed, and I'm trying to work for change in this world so those things never happen again. And I guess I'm looking at this film thinking, like, what do I need to do in my life now as a Christian? I'm tied into this movement, even if I don't identify with it, but it's still part of my religious tradition. They're still somehow brothers and sisters in that kind of religious language, even though they feel so far. I feel more connected to David Brandwein than I do, to some of the evangelicals in this film. As a Jew, it's just, that's just a reality now. That's kind of my life now. I feel more connected to some of my Jewish friends in West Hartford than I do evangelicals, even though we share faith, to the Kentucky pastor. It's raised some real interesting questions for me. I don't know what sorts of questions it might raise for people in the audience on that front. I was pretty uncomfortable with a lot of the things I saw tonight or in the movie, with, especially prosperity gospel things. And I don't know. That's my confessional for you. But I don't think I answered the question you wanted me to answer, but I felt like I got to say that at some point. Like, there's a lot of tension here, but I'm not going to leave my faith. It's very important to me. But I also need to just acknowledge that there's some really uncomfortable things that I have with my own family, and I'm not sure what to do with them. And do I just kind of let them? So it's not just like this discomfort of working together across religious lines. There's a discomfort within our own communities and our own religious families. So.
Well, thank you, Joel, for sharing that. And before I turn things back over to Avi as we wind down, I think we've both talked about things across the religions, but I think we'd all acknowledge that within both Judaism and Christianity, the question of Israel, the question of Palestine is a contentious issue that results in many different viewpoints, and may, as you suggested, Joel, not only for Christians, I think also for Jews, sometimes means that within the same religion, people feel like their allies may be outside the religion, and a lot of those, we see that in this film in one dimension, but there's probably many other dimensions to that as well. So I really want to thank you both for really putting a lot on the table, for sharing honestly and personally some really great insights, as well as sharing with us your professional expertise. I know I learned a lot from the two of you tonight, and I'm sure our audience did as well. So thank you so much. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Dr. Pott.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. And I like being able to jump back onto screen and join you as if we're almost in the same room together. So first of all, please join me virtually in thanking our fantastic panel. I want to thank our moderator, Professor Jeremy Pressman, and Dr. Joel Lohr, President of the Hartford Seminary, and Dr. Amy Weiss, Director of the Maurice Greenberg Center for Judaic Studies at the University of Hartford. This has been really a fantastic, fascinating, thought-provoking, but also very, very difficult discussion. And I want to thank you for guiding us so adeptly through the many issues that the film raises. If you have not yet seen the film, I think it is still available for streaming, maybe through the rest of the night. You might be motivated to watch the film. And I will also note that tonight's program was recorded, so we will have a link available to share if you missed any portion of the program, or if you have friends or family members who you think should view this recording as well. Please join us for the remaining films of the inaugural virtual Hartford Jewish Film Festival. Jen Sharp, our director of the festival, tells me that Till Kingdom Come is available to stream through the Hartford Jewish Film Festival until 7 p.m. tomorrow. So if you haven't seen it yet, I would encourage you to take the opportunity to watch it. And we have excellent films coming up for the rest of the month of March, really fantastic films that are included in this year's film festival, including next week a film called Shared Legacies, a documentary on the African-American Jewish relationship in the United States and the Civil Rights Movement, and a post-film discussion with Professor Susanna Heschel, who also appears in the film. This will take place next Thursday, March 18th at the same time. So thank you again to our wonderful panelists, and thank you to everyone for being here tonight. Everybody stay healthy, be well, be safe, and we'll see you very soon. Thank you.